attribution, first of all, thanks to the university libraries and SUL, the Department of Research and Scholarship, for all the work we're doing in support of open access and Open Access Week this week. Special thanks for this event to CART Services for accessibility transcription, Pat Hunt for help today, and John Star Wars, who's helping with live streaming. So the presentation component of today will be online through Surface, long-term in a few weeks. The presentation today is live streamed. The Q&A session will not be. When we get to the Q&A session, please use the microphone, which Pat will be providing, so that we can have the transcription for the Q&A as well. My agenda today is to talk about the overall landscape of Are the lights okay?
Yeah, next to it.
For those of you in the back, is the lights better? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay. Is my volume okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So the agenda today is a discussion of the scholarly communications landscape, a review in general of terminology that is important to know, and just a general overview. I'm going to discuss intellectual property and open access, go into more detail on rights and versioning, talk in depth about some things I consider policy, services, and infrastructure that I'd like to highlight for everybody, and then just leave you with some tips and takeaways. So, scholarly communications. This is just a little thought I'd like all of you to have in the back of your minds today and moving ahead. We're all travelers in one way or another, like Little Red Riding Hood, journeying through the forest, going on an adventure, whether it's to see family and friends or through our careers, seeing where we want to go with our scholarship or the services and support that we provide for others. But I'd also like us to remember that sometimes there is animals and wolves or things that need consideration in our travels, and it's not always about safety along the way. So that's just a touch point I'd like you to have in the back of your heads as I move along. Has anyone seen this photo before? Okay. This is a representation of the world and the internet today. It's a visual of the Internet of Things. As we know, the world is a really big and really small place with a lot of different components and infrastructures. An example of this would be the railroad system, right? So this is the Amtrak station in 1992. We still have an Amtrak station today. And we have all sorts of railways, highways, bypasses, etc. that connect our country and the world. Electricians, fixing utility poles. Of course, we have all these different communication channels in the world. We have the phones, we have electricity, we have gas companies. This is another type of infrastructure you find in the world today. And even now, especially the last few decades, you could include solar energy, non-fossil fuel energies as part of our national infrastructures. By the way, all of the images and graphs you see today are either in the public domain or licensed open access in some capacity. So, I also think of computer networks the internet, the systems and the people behind the internet and the World Wide Web, and all of the work that we do in academia, libraries, information technology. For me, all of this is also infrastructure, right? Just like the railroads, just like telecommunications, just like everything else that's a part of today's world, whether we're talking about the work we do in our careers or at home in the apartments, houses, and condos we live in. So going back to the landscape, a little bit of accolades to one of my favorite musicians, but also a little bit of Americana culture. From the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. Woody Guthrie. So all of these infrastructures, whether you're talking about railroads or telecommunications or IT, that's part of our landscape, our world today, and the global ecosystem of scholarly communications. Does anyone know what this is?
First journal published.
Yes, thank you. So, 1776, the Philosophical Transactions was published as the first journal. A number of scholars got together and said, what would it look like if we as a community got together and started publishing our works? And thus was born the first journal, and scholarly communications, scholarly publishing, academic writing, the sharing of knowledge today. Just remember that, and we're going to come back to that. So, what terms do you need to know if you don't already? You might already. Open access, the work we do with scholarly communications in academia, is part of a broader spectrum. It's part of intellectual property. Intellectual property is rights that are rights given to people, most of the time, sometimes corporations, over a creation of your mind. They will give creators the rights, whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive, over the use of his, her, or their creation for a set period of time. It's important to note that intellectual property is slightly different in each country. So moving ahead, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is US-based, but intellectual property law will be different in the US, Canada, Germany, the UK, etc. There are two types of intellectual property rights: copyright and other rights under copyright, which the majority of today I will talk about, and industrial property. Industrial property rights include patent and trademarks. And copyright and other rights under copyright can include the public domain, fair use or fair dealing, licenses, author rights, and open access. So for example, today I'm talking about open access, scholarly communications, but not everything applies to open access. For example, sometimes patents or trademarks, these also fall under intellectual property, but they may not need to be, or open access doesn't necessarily apply because it falls under the industrial property component of intellectual property. So, I believe a lot of you already know this, but just for review, a license is a contract type, an agreement, an obligation, or a legal tie that binds parties to pay a specific set of monies or perform a specific activity. So a publication contract, a library license for materials, a database license, something you have to sign on Facebook. These are all various types of licenses. Also intellectual property. Author rights are a broad set of reuse rights that we as authors, or the authors that we support if we're librarians, choose to keep or we choose to give away for various types of literature or creative works that we write. Publishers, who are the copyright holders, may choose to license these rights back to us, or they may choose to not give them back to us, depending on their values and best practices. Examples are self-archiving rights, scholarly sharing rights, and use for instruction and research purposes. This is not the full suite of rights that can be included as author rights, but for the purposes of today, these are key ones to remember that you as an author may have, you may not have in a publication contract that is standard to a template. Self-archiving rights include the ability to deposit on your website or an institutional repository of a specific version, and we will get to types of versions later. Deposit in repositories, sometimes it is absolutely very specific to non-commercial repositories only. Sometimes it's very broad, as in whichever repository you want, it doesn't matter. And sometimes it's outlined that you can have self-archiving rights specific only to something that's called the preprint open access repository, but not other repositories. Does anyone know what scholarly sharing rights are? It's a big fancy word, which personally I don't like, for, hey, I want to give my coworker or my colleague who is in the office next to me a copy of my work. Or we are in a journal book club and we're sharing copies of our own work for discovery and conversation. You sometimes even need those rights to share with your colleagues and your peers in the same academic disciplines as you. So, open access. Open access is the ability to read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, link to full texts of articles, crawl for indexing, also known as data mining or text mining sometimes, pass scholarly literature off as data into software, or use literature for any other lawful purpose without financial, legal, or technical barriers. This is the definition from the Budapest Open Access Initiative from 2002. A simpler definition is literature that is digital and online, free of charge, and free of copyright and licensing restrictions. Two main methods of delivery of getting open access include Green Repository, which is a repository-based method, and Gold, which is through publishing houses, presses, so it may not be in a database or repository, but the publisher actively makes it open access from the get-go. (13) 6,141, 964, 726. In 2002, 13 people got together in Budapest to say, hey, we are so sick of having to not be able to provide access to our own writings to everyone we want to. Let's come up with this idea. Let's brainstorm. How can we solve this problem? There's got to be an answer. I am sure that part of that brainstorming was libraries are essential. But there's got to be a more to the answer. There are 13 founding signatories of the Budapest Open Access Initiative 2002. Today, 2018, 6,141 people, as of last night, signed it as individuals, and 964 institutions signed it as supporting institutions, saying we value the idea of open access as an additional way to provide access to information to the world and others. Currently, there are 726 policies that are in support of either faculty or staff or students at an institutional, corporate, or funder level that support open access scholarship for authors. What happened in 1776? Oh, come on, guys. Two major things happened in the world in 1776. No idea? The American Revolution! Okay, thank you. Thank you. The American Revolution, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the first journal. The first journal. That was a long time ago, huh? Yeah. 1964, ERIC, which is a database, for those of you who may not know, ERIC is a database of government documents for educational resources. It was founded and it began. So ERIC, it's a database, and way back in the 60s, the government said, we need to make this resource free and publicly accessible. So there were federal organizations and governments thinking about free access to education and materials way back in the 60s. Does anyone want to take a guess at what happened in 1983? ARPANET, which was the beginning of the internet, was founded. 1989 to 1995, the World Wide Web really started flourishing. Tim Berners-Lee came up with the idea in 1989 while at CERN, and things started really moving in terms of the World Wide Web and IT infrastructures during that 6-year time frame. 2002, the Budapest Open Access Initiative, the real gem of the idea of fostering more open access to information, especially taxpayer-funded information, started in 2002, 2003, 2004. And today we are in 2018. So I just want to pause here for a second. This admittedly not accessibility-friendly graphic. These are terms I'm not necessarily going to go over today, but just to have in the back of your mind as things that are part of this scholarly communications landscape and the work that we do in support of our readers, in support of ourselves as authors, in support of our patrons if we are librarians. We have open access, Creative Commons, policy development, infrastructure, discovery, contracts, green, gold, hybrid, bronze, Creative Commons, author rights, rights retention, flipped journals, persistent URLs, preservation, societies, publishers, toll access, paywalls, discovery, publication, sources, distribution, accessibility. Anyone want to throw any other terms into the mix? So, going back to the original definition, free online literature. Open access is not free, of course. Green and gold have two different economic models. Gold, open access publishing, depending on the publisher, may or may not have article processing charges. And green open access is supported by institutions or funders who run the repositories. So like everything else in libraries, organizations, and institutions, somebody pays for it, of course, but the point is that the readers don't have to. The people must know before they can act. Ida B. Wells. So, what more should you know? I'd like you to pause for a minute and ask yourself, what rights are important to you as an author when you write? And also, if you are in service of patrons or authors, depending on what your role is, what rights are important to your authors and your patrons? This, of course, is not the same for everybody, but I'd like to encourage everyone to ask this question. In open access, we work with rights and versioning as indicators and markers of quality because, going back to the Budapest Open Access Initiative, we want legal, lawful reuse. And it all comes down to our publication contract. I know you can't see the writing in this contract, but this is a standard copyright transfer contract. In my personal opinion, there are many, many, many more publishers today that are much more friendly towards the author and the rights that we would like than there were in 2002, in 2010. So the scholarly communication landscape is more benevolent towards authors and reuse rights than it was at one time. However, it all comes down to the publication contract, and it's important not to assume that because we sign as authors a publication contract, that means that self-archiving rights or reuse for research and instruction are going to be included. Creative Commons and open licensing are one way to keep your copyright and allow open distribution of your work. Creative Commons is one type of open licensing to help license creative works while creators retain copyright and allow others to copy, distribute, and make certain uses of their work. Sometimes this applies just to non-commercial use. Creative Commons licenses ensure attribution and credit of authorship. It allows for global distribution, and like a lot of other intellectual property rights, lasts as long as the applicable copyright term. So a Creative Commons license in the US wouldn't last the same term as one in Germany, Canada, the UK, etc., because copyright law is different in each country. I know we're not talking about free speech here, but I just wanted to add this to encourage thoughtfulness. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Frederick Douglass. So, playing on rights and versioning, there are times when we have the legal reuse rights as authors for specific versions, and I'd encourage you to think about which rights are important to you or your patrons, but it also goes down to the version. And are the versions that you can get access to, does that pair well with your opinion of how much access, distribution, and global distribution that you want for yourself? Because we all define these things differently for our own ethics. 3 types of versions you should know include the preprint, which is pre-peer review. It's also known as the accepted author manuscript, and the vast majority of publications allow for submission of the preprint to a repository, and the authors will always hold copyright to the preprint. The postprint is the final draft or the final manuscript of the work. It's post-peer review in cases that the work is peer-reviewed, because as we know, not all article or scholarly literature types go through a peer review process, such as book reviews, etc. It's also known as the author final version, and most publication contracts allow for submission of the author final version to repositories, at the very least disciplinary repositories and non-commercial repositories. When it is the case that you have to sign over a copyright agreement, the copyright agreement does not, it is not considered for this. So, like the preprint, authors will keep the copyright to the author final manuscript. The publisher version is the final copy, also post peer review in cases that the publication is peer reviewed, and it's post copy editing and proofreading. It's also simply known as the final version. There are certain publishing contracts that do also allow for submission of this. So in those cases, you could submit the preprint, the postprint, and the publisher version, but not in all cases. So it is less common that you'll be able to have self-archiving rights to a final publisher version, but it does happen. When you sign over a copyright transfer agreement, it applies to the final version. So going back to my encouragement for all of you as authors, and is to ask yourself, are the contracts that you've signed or encouraged your patrons to sign, is it equal or not equal to your values? Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." And I know he said this quite a while ago, but I feel like, especially in the last few years, this still rings true. So a few takeaways and tips. Currently, Surface, as one example of many different types of open access repositories, has global distribution. This is one of the benefits of open access, is it's not available just at your library, or if your library has enough money, blessedly, to have that publication. So, Surface, these are only the top 15 countries. We do have access. We've had downloads from every continent except Antarctica, and we are not as old or as big as some repositories, so please take this as just one example, and this applies to all open access repositories and also publications, whether you're talking about green or gold. So we have Pakistan, Korea, Indonesia, the Netherlands, Malaysia, Russia, Australia, France, Germany, Canada, the Philippines, China, India, the United Kingdom, and the US are the top 15 countries that are using Syracuse University Open Access Works. We have 20 top disciplines in Surface, and again, I show this just as an example of one of many repositories. There are disciplinary repositories, institutional repositories, and gold open access journals and books. And so this global distribution applies to all types of open access. So I know you can't see this completely, so I will read the discipline types. We have physics, computer science, architecture, social and behavioral sciences, education, arts and humanities, commercial law, library and information science, archaeological anthropology, economics, engineering, chemistry, mathematics, electrical and computer engineering, physical sciences and mathematics, biology, ecology, religion, urban, community, and regional planning, and arts and humanities. Of course, we have other disciplines in Surface, as do other repositories, but these are the top ones. So going back to takeaways, I would ask your scholar voice and the scholars that you serve, are we serving them to the greatest degree, and are we complimenting ourselves and advocating enough for ourselves as authors to the best of our ability to reach our readers and to get as much global distribution as we can for our works and our patrons? Please continue to research, write, create knowledge, and to think about change. If you go back to 1776 to 2018, oh my gosh, how has the world changed since then? And it's actually changed quite a bit since 2002, even then. So a few questions for the crowd, and we have a little bit of a survey, and then we're going to go. Are you reaching the scholars and readers in which you particularly want to reach as an author? What top 3 to 5 publishers do you use? Have you evaluated your personal publishing motivations and workflows recently? And if you have, do they match your needs? Do you have an experts at Syracuse profile, or at the very least an ORCID profile, or a selected works profile, in order to promote your own self, your own voice, and your own scholarship? Are you using Surface, our institutional repository, or other disciplinary repositories to legally distribute your expertise, your voice, your scholarship to readers and colleagues across the world? Okay, so for those of you who have a smartphone or a computer, we have a very short 4-question survey. It's https://bit.ly/Q_UI. And if anyone needs it, Pat has the link as well. Have you ever I can get people to show me hands when they're done, but we'll wait a few more minutes.
Does anyone else want the URL? Man, I think a lot of people might have missed it.
Okay.
And when it was on the prompter or on the cart up there, it was all capital, so it didn't, and it's case sensitive, so
Okay.
in case people use the one over there.
The last question was a little ambiguous. Was it a question or was it just, let's check?
I know. That's purposeful.
Oh.
Well, we can take the time we need, so. more time? Let's see. Have you ever read your publication contract? Awesome! Definitely yes. 7. Why? 1. Yeah, I know the feeling. I think so. I will now. 3. Have you ever used open access materials in your research or instruction? Definitely yes. Wonderful. Personally, sometimes I do ask the question, how do I find out if something is OA or reusable legally? This is called bronze OA, or sometimes people just call it gray because it's confusing and unclear. So I can say I've definitely said, marked the first one. And no. Question 3. Here we go. Decisions based on evidence, data, ethics, and mission and strategies align with my personal and professional values and needs. Yes, maybe. How does this relate to my scholarship? Most people say yes. Sometimes it's hard to say. I understand that. We'll get to that in a bit. Examples of infrastructure that support open scholarship, open access, and your scholarly work. Funding agencies and universities with policies implemented on public access, open access, and data. Libraries, public and universities, utilities, computer networks, publishers and presses, open source technologies and systems, technologists, librarians, university support staff, and faculty. And yes, it's true, the second and last one are similar. So, I asked this just to see where we're all at, but also to encourage broader reuse. And also, because for me, part of today is to help all of you and myself think about if we're doing things as authors and people who serve authors the best way we need to, and also to pair our professional work, broadening access to information in ways in which we want to and in ways in which we should for the greater good. Paul Allen, who, for those of you who may not know, was one of the co-founders of Microsoft, said there are relatively few ideas that you can do just by yourself. And he also noted that each failure contains the seeds of your next success, if you are willing to learn from it. So, I note this because whether or not we've actually read our publication contracts, whether or not we've actually used open access resources in our own research or writings before, whether or not it seems that our personal and professional values match the work that we do with evidence-based discovery and goal setting, it's useful to evaluate, to ask ourselves, is what we did yesterday relevant and applicable to the things we want to do tomorrow? And we can't do that without sometimes failing, but also inquiring. And so I really like those 2 quotes from Paul Allen. So, infrastructures, services, and policies. These are statistics that are openly available through the Association of Research Libraries from 2015 and 2016. It's not all ARL institutions, but it's a few. And like SU, all of these institutions feel that they are blessed with, I think it's definitely safe to say from colleagues I know at all of these institutions, they feel honored and joyful that we have the budgets that we have, but we also feel that sometimes we have to cut and make hard, difficult decisions on how we spend the monies that we spend. So in 2015 and 2016, Harvard had 48.1, Cornell 21.5, Columbia 32, Syracuse 10.9, SUNY Albany 5.5, and SUNY Stony Brook 9.1. So one of the things that plays with infrastructure, licensing, the collections, and how we serve ourselves, our scholars, our authors, our patrons, is the difficult decisions sometimes we have to make with our budgets. And open access is right in line with that. That's partially why I thanked Syracuse University and Syracuse University Libraries for supporting open access initiatives for Syracuse, and why these institutions do the same. But the reality is, with the cost of publishing and staffing and just general economics today, it's a hard decision-making process, I believe. So I just want to end by saying I believe it's all connected, whether we're talking about evidence-based decision-making, budgets, or the work that we do as individual authors in deciding where or when or how to publish. It's a little bit about policies and processes and publication contracts and all of the granular detail. It's a little bit about infrastructures, technologies, the systems we choose to have, and it's also a lot about our communities, our colleagues, our audiences, and our peers. So I will end with a few questions to just leave you brainstorming about. Do your research and instruction processes match your professional and personal ethics, but also your obligations? How can you foster more economic equality for others and other institutions who are less fortunate than SU, while also enabling greater discovery of your own authorship, of your own scholar voice, and sharing that domain knowledge that you have as an individual and an expert? How can we at SU build more support for research, creative works, and open access? I'd encourage you to question your path. If you question it, moving ahead tomorrow may be the same as last year and the year before, but it's always good to pause and say, yes, I believe in what I'm doing, or let's reorient. And ask yourself, what greater impact can you make to your own scholarship, to Syracuse University, and to create broader access? Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens, such as 13 people, can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead. Thank you. So now if anyone has any questions, we have plenty of time. Okay. Well, in that case, thank you for coming. If you'd like a copy of this or to be notified when it is available, leave your name and phone number, your name and email address, and I'll make sure you get a notification. It won't be used for anything else, just for this notification. Thanks for coming. Reach out. Open Publishing Services are online through the library's website, and good luck with all of your writing